I think you can. And we all said, yes, sir, we can. And I put my head down and I put my forehead on it and I cried. I cried and I said, Granny, I love you, Granny. I know you care about me and I care about you.
About 900 to 1,000 feet in elevation in a very short period, or short little space. So they built these loops up the mountain. Now the way they did it was after the Civil War, many of the Confederate soldiers had been killed. There was a shortage of manpower in the region. Slavery was, quote, over. However, many convicts found themselves incarcerated.
What is this?
Who?
I hadn't seen this many people in one room since I was 25 years old. That was in March of 1876 in Wilmington, North Carolina. That's where I grew up, in the flatlands. The land down there is as flat as a tabletop. And I was in court in March of 1876. The judge said, "You're guilty, boy. I sentenced you to 5 years of hard labor." I didn't care about that. That's all I ever knew was hard. Labor was nothing to me. That was every day. But then the judge said something I didn't like hearing. He said, "I'm sending you to the state penitentiary in Raleigh." Didn't like the sound of that. I'd never been to no place besides Wilmington other than where I was born at, which was in a little shed in 1851, about 15 miles outside of Wilmington. My parents were slaves. That meant I was a bonus. I was nothing but a bonus to the master. I was real happy when the Civil War ended, and I was real happy when we got free, but it didn't make no difference. We didn't leave the little shack we lived in because we had no place to go. We had nothing but poverty, and if we was to move somewhere, we'd be taking our poverty with us. I had nothing to look for, except now I was going to Raleigh to the state penitentiary. Mother boys and I went there. We got there, walked up to this great big brick building. Went inside, stunk. Kind of dark and dingy. And they showed us where we was going to be sleeping. I had my own bed. Just me in it. I'd never had a bed with just me in it before. The mattress was nothing but a toe sack with straw in it. Seemed like that anyhow. But it was my place to sleep. We had food to eat. We had it 2 times a day. Now they put something in the food that I had never tasted before. And I didn't like it. I thought they was kind of poisonous. Another one of the boys there said, "That's called salt." I'd never tasted salt before. After a few days, though, I kind of liked it. Kind of got used to it. It was a tough place to be. Boss man, they called every guard was called boss man. Boss man carried a stick. Every boss man carried a stick. If you look at him wrong, you got a stick upside your arm, your back, your leg, whatever he decided he wanted to hit. One day after several months, boss man said, "Get over here in this room." He said it to me and a bunch of others. So we went in this room. And he said, "Get your face against the wall and put your hands behind your back." So that's what we did. We faced the wall. We put our hands behind our back. Another boss man come along with handcuffs. And he handcuffed me to the boy on my right. And he handcuffed me to the boy on my left. Then another boss man come along with some lead shackles. And he shackled my ankles to the boy on my right and to the boy on my left. Then he said, "Turn around." He just wanted to laugh when he said that. You can't turn around unless all 5 of you, because there was 5 of us together, not just 3, 5. You can't turn around unless all 5 of you figure out how you're going to do it. And you better figure it out pretty quick, because boss man said do it. And when boss man says do something, you do it. Or you find out what the stick feels like. So we turned around. Boss man then said, follow boss man with the gun. You try to take a step or two, you find out real quick. You can't walk regular when you're hooked up to people on both sides of you. There's only one way you can do that when you ain't got time to practice. You get a quick rhythm going and you sort of prance. You feel like a fool, but you can't help it, because that's the only way you can do it. You get a little rhythm and you sort of bounce and you go together as you walk. We walked to the door of the prison. Boss man led us out. He led us all the way through downtown Raleigh on them dirt roads, because that's all there was, of course, was dirt roads in downtown Raleigh. We made a little bit of jingling sound with our shackles and with our chains. Otherwise, it was quiet. What a sight. What a sight. There was about 35 of us in groups of 5, prancing along through the dirt streets of Raleigh, wearing our black and white stripes. We went to the depot train area. The boss man said, stay right there. So we stood right there. We didn't know why we were there. Boss man didn't ever say where we were going or what we was going to be doing or why. And one thing about it, convicts don't ask no questions. You might want to know, but you're going to find out if they want you to find out. Otherwise, you have to figure it out, or you ain't going to find out. So we stood there. We stood there. We didn't stand beside the kind of cars you get onto when you pay your money and get a ticket. That's not where we were standing. We were standing at a boxcar. A boxcar is them cars that they put lumber and produce and stuff in it to take it down to in some other place. We stood at the boxcar. Boxcars at the front of the train. Passenger cars at the back of the train. Because there's soot and there's cinders and there's smoke from the smokestack of the wood-burning locomotive that gets in the cars at the front. They don't want the people who pay the money to have to breathe the soot and the smoke and experience the cinders and the stink. So they sit in the passenger cars at the back, the preferred area. We was there at the front beside a boxcar. Another boss man came along in a few minutes, opened the door of the boxcar. The floor of the boxcar comes right up to your rib cage. Boss man said, get in. There won't no steps. There won't no stool, won't no box, won't no ramp, won't no nothing. Boss man said, get in. So we had to get in. Convicts are not known for the trait of cooperation. It would have been a funny sight to see if we hadn't been the ones trying to do it. But we got in because boss man said do it. We got inside, 35 of us in a boxcar. This was in February of 1877. It was a cold day. The door closed on the boxcar. We heard a metal peg go in the latch. And there we were. For about an hour, we just sort of stood there. Boss man back at the prison did not say, go get your stuff and bring it out because we're going somewhere. That was a pretty good reason he didn't say, go get your stuff, because we didn't have no stuff. You don't go to the state penitentiary with a suitcase. What I got there with was the clothes I was wearing. Them clothes was burned, and I was getting these instead. These was made there at the penitentiary. My shoes, they was made at the penitentiary as well. Everything I had, I got at the penitentiary. We were a very mobile group. It took no planning in advance to get a bunch of convicts going anywhere. After about an hour in this dark, cold boxcar, the door opened. Now our eyes had sort of got used to the dark, and when the door opened, the bright sun came in and it hurt our eyes, but who cares? Boss had put a bucket of water and a dipper inside the boxcar, and they put in a cloth sack full of hoe cakes. Hoe cakes, that's nothing but a big biscuit. It's called hoe cakes because the slaves used to be out chopping cotton in the fields. And about lunchtime, they'd go over to one area of the field where somebody would have made a fire. They had the dough, the raw dough, and the slaves would brush the dirt off of the blade of their hoe, and they'd put the dough on the blade, and they'd hold it over the coals so it could cook. And they had a hoe cake. Well, that's what we had in the sack. Hoe cakes and water. They closed the door back, put the peg back. Nobody said nothing about nothing. We just didn't know where we was going to be going. We didn't know how long we were going to be there. We didn't know what we were going to do when we got there. There we were. After a while, we just sort of sat down. It was cold. It was February. When 35 men wearing stripes sit down in a small boxcar, you rub up against each other. Convicts don't like it. They didn't like the fact that we had to rub up against each other, but there was nothing else you could do. You do what you have to do. Nobody said nothing about when we was able to drink the water or when we was to be able to eat the hoe cake. We weren't used to having to make decisions ourselves. Boss man usually said everything. So, after a while, we drank some water, we ate some hoe cakes. After a while then, the train began to move. It'd go for a while, then it would stop. Then it would go for a while, then it would stop. In the young corner of the boxcar, there was a little hole in the floor for necessary purposes. There's nothing else in there other than us, except a little bit of straw on the floor. You don't understand what it's like until you're in the situation when you're linked up with handcuffs and shackles to 4 other people when one of you has to go to the hole in the floor in the back corner. You got to wade through the others that are in front of you, and they don't want to move. It was not a fun trip. We went for a while, and finally it got dark. It got nighttime. We could see through cracks in the walls enough to know if it was light or if it was dark. And it was dark, and the train stopped. We heard some people walk by. We figured they was getting off. And we figured they're going to open the door. We're going to go somewhere to sleep. That was a faulty assumption. We stayed right there. Somebody opened the door, they put in some more water in the bucket, and they put in another bag of hoe cakes. And then they closed the door back and put that metal peg back. So there we were, to spend the night sitting in the boxcar. Next morning, door opened again, more water, more hoe cakes. After a while, the train moved. We did this all day. A little bit we'd go, then it would stop, and go and stop. We finally got to a place and we sat there for a long time. People went by, we heard noise, and we heard people out in the not too far distance, but they paid no attention to this train. Boss man came over and he opened the door. And he said, "Get off." So we got off. What I saw when I got off of that boxcar absolutely terrified me. What I saw, it looked like the world had exploded. And the dirt and the rocks and the trees and the bushes stayed up in the air. One of the other boys said, "This is mountains." Well, I had never seen a mountain before. And I thought, ain't be no such thing as a mountain. Can't be the dirt staying up. It's going to fall back on us like a wave in the Atlantic Ocean fall. We're going to be squished here. And they said, no, it stays that way. I didn't believe them, but I knew I couldn't do nothing about it. I figured I was just going to get killed in a couple of minutes when it all come falling back down. Boss man said, you're going to follow boss man with a gun. It was this wide pathway. It was about 15 feet wide. It was kind of smooth. And it went right by this depot building. There were some letters on the side, but I couldn't read nothing. I didn't know what it said. I heard someone say something about Henry Station. That didn't mean nothing to me. I didn't know what Henry Station was or where it was or nothing. I knew it was in a foreign land because all our land I'd ever seen was flat. And here we are with the land stuck up in the sky. We were walking. Then boss man, we didn't get far. Boss man stopped us and he said, I'm going to tell you what kind of critters live here in these mountains. And I didn't want to tell you what they would do to you if they caught you. And I didn't want to tell you how big they get. But I will tell you this. If you run, we will not come after you to save you. That is all boss man had to tell me. I was going to obey all of the rules. I wouldn't even think about running because I didn't know this was a horrible looking place. It did remind me of what my granny. My granny was the only person that ever really seemed to care about me anyhow. And she'd tell me things sometimes. And she said, the preacher said one time, the good book says, I will lift up my eyes unto the hills from whence cometh my help. My help comes from the Lord. And I thought, Lord, help me! Because I was scared. I was scared. But I couldn't show fear. I learned real quick at the penitentiary. Convicts who show fear don't live well. You can't show it. You can't act it. You just got to do it. So my stomach and my heart, they were fighting with each other inside of me, but I couldn't show it on my face. We just had to follow along the boss man with the gun. And we were still hooked together, so we had to be prancing. And we were prancing our way down this pathway, about 15 feet wide. And we got to a place, the boss man said, this is the stockade where you're going to be staying. It's called the Round Knob Stockade. He said, go inside. We went inside, and they took off our handcuffs, and they took off our foot shackles. And he said, find you a bunk. You better pick one that ain't being used already by the boys that are out working, because when they get back, if you're in their bunk, this will be a problem. In the middle of this long, narrow building that had 25 bunks on each side and a narrow opening between, these bunks were 3 beds high. In the middle, there was a pot-bellied stove that burnt wood. It was a little bit warm from the previous night. We were the new ones. We just got there. The other ones had been there for up to 6 months. We got the beds at the end. In the walls, there were some windows, some openings. Of course, there weren't no glass. There were some wooden shutters that they would close. And the wooden shutters helped to keep the wind out, but it didn't help nothing. It didn't keep the cold out. And when you're sitting in a bed trying to sleep, and you're at the end of the building, and the stove is in the middle of the building, you find out real quick the heat don't come right that far. But I had my own bed. And so that was about as good as it was going to get. So we went to sleep when it got dark. Because boss man said, when it gets dark, you go to sleep. Some of the other boys wanted to kind of horse around a little bit. I had enough sense to not do that kind of stuff, so I went to sleep. Next morning, before it was even light, where it is bang, bang, bang on the side of the building, and this boss man said, get up now. So we got up. When you're sleeping in the round knob stockade, you don't take your clothes off because you'll freeze if you do. If you wanted a pillow, you'd have to roll up your shirt if you could stand the stink. But then if you did that, you'd be cold. So I left my clothes on because I was going to try to stay warm. So therefore, when boss man said, get up now, I got up real quick and I got down. I was on the top bunk. It ain't easy to get out from the top bunk when it's dark and you can't see nothing, but you know there's two boys below you and you just hope you don't kick them accidentally, because if you do, you're going to be in a pile of trouble real fast. I made it to the floor without kicking anybody, which was a good thing. Boss man came in with a lantern, something I didn't see hardly ever. He came in with a lantern and that helped me see a little bit, and I was amazed at all those many people. There was way over 100 people that were sleeping. I heard lots of snoring and sounds, and the smell was unbelievable. It was like he was in a barn, but it was the only place that we had, and that's where we were. Boss man said, come out and go somewhere you're going to get some victuals. That's the first good thing I heard since I got there. We went over to this shed. We went outside. We followed boss man to this shed. We could see the fire under the shed at a distance, and we got closer. We could smell a little bit. We could smell there was some food, and that smelled real good. There were some plates there. We got these metal plates, and we went over one at a time. There were some lady convicts there, and they cooked the food. We put our plate out, and they plopped a great big old spoonful of cornmeal mush. Then, next lady down there put a big old spoon of peas on the plate. Some mornings, it was a big old spoonful of cabbage. There's lots of cabbage that we had at breakfast time. And there was a piece of pork. Sometimes it was a piece of deer meat, but most of the time it was pork. Sometimes it was beef, but not very often. But we had beef or pork or some kind of meat at least once a day, and usually 2 times a day. Not a whole lot of it, but we had it. And we had some sort of a cornmeal or corn or potatoes or peas or cabbage. It was a decent amount. It just didn't taste good at all. They didn't have no salt at Henry Station, and I'd gotten kind of used to that stuff. We ate our food, and boss man said, come outside. Time to do some work. So we went outside, and he said, I want this group, and he broke us up into groups. He said, this group stays over here, this group goes to that boss man, this group goes to that boss man, to go to different places. I went with the group over here, this boss man, and he said, we're going to go out, and your job is going to be to get to where the big wide path gets narrow. When it gets narrow, we're going to spread out, and we're going to cover 15 feet. And you're going to use the tool, you're going to use your tool, and you're going to dig down, and you're going to make it smooth, 15 feet wide, just like the pathway that you walked on to get here when you got off of the boxcar. It's going to be that smooth, and it's going to be that wide, and it's going to be that flat. So we walked out there. We was walking out into the woods. We wasn't carrying nothing with a handle. There was no tools. We got there and boss man said, now get your tool and get to work. Digging. We couldn't do nothing. And I'm thinking, we're going to get killed right here because we can't do what boss man says to do. I thought we're going to be using our hands, our fingers, and we're going to have to be digging in the dirt with our fingers. And boss man said, we can't afford no shovels and hoes and picks and stuff like that. The tool that you're going to be using to do this job is a flat rock. So find a flat rock. Now don't get too far off of the trail. Remember what boss man said about the critters that live in the mountains. You get too far gone and they're not glad you. They'll be sorry to see you go. They'll be glad to devour you. He said, find you a rock. Get it bigger than a dinner plate. Get it where it's not too thick, because you've got to be using it all day long. So I said a prayer. I hadn't said a prayer since I was a little boy. And here I was 25, 26 years old. And I knew I had to find me a rock like everybody else did. So I sort of slowly inched my way. I was looking. I was desperate. Everybody was. We was just looking, trying to find some kind of rock. And I spotted one. And I ran over and I got the rock. And I picked it up. And I got my rock and I carried it back and I went back to where I was supposed to be standing. And I stood there with my rock. And I thought, boss man's going to say, you got a good rock there, boy. Boss man didn't say nothing. Boss man never said stuff that was good. Now, if you did something bad, he'd tell you real quick. If you did something stupid, he'd say that real quick. He would never say, good job, boy. He would never say that. But I had my rock, and I thought it was a pretty good rock. Because he didn't say, go get another one, I figured it was okay. Then he said, dig down where you are 6 inches and make it smooth. And he spaced us out about where we was about 3 feet apart. And I got down on my knees and I began to dig with my rock, and then I would dig, scrape to get the dirt loose. First few times I did that, I thought, this is not a bad job. This is okay. I can do this. Then after about 30 seconds, when I was digging and pulling and scraping, I hit a root. First time you hit a root, when you're pulling with your strength and you're holding a rock that has jagged edges, you find out real quick, it will cut your hand and you will start to bleed. And your hand will hurt. And my hands hurt. And they hurt all day. Do you think you could say, excuse me, boss man, I'm hurting. Can I go lie down? He'd have took his whip to me if I had said some stupid thing like that. You keep working. You don't put down your rock. You don't stop digging. We did this all day. What we would do with the dirt, once we got enough scraped, we put our rock down, we pile the dirt on top of our rock, then we'd stand up. When the whole group was standing up, boss man said, now, go this way. And he would tell us where to go. We'd follow the boss man to a low area, and then we would pour the dirt off our rock. Then he said, stomp on. So we'd stomp on the dirt. He said, go back and do it again. We did that all day long. My hands, after about an hour or two, became numb. That was a good thing because the pain stopped. It wasn't hurting anymore. They were still bleeding, but I couldn't feel nothing anymore. That night, when we got back into the bunks, I put my rock under my feet. I thought it was a pretty good rock, and I thought somebody would take it if they got half a chance. So I put it under my feet so I could sleep under it. And I slept that night. It wasn't comfortable, but I slept. Next morning we got up, we did the same thing. We used the rocks. We did the same thing not only that day, that next day, but the day after that, and the day after that, and the day after that, and the week after that, and the week after, and the month after that, and the month after that. We covered about 2.5 miles of making what was a path 15 feet wide and smooth. And we had to dig down. Boss man would say sometimes in this area, you digging down about 3 inches or 2 inches. In this area, you dig down about 12 inches. I thought, how does he know this? I couldn't ask that question, but I was curious. I thought, he ain't a smart man. How does he know how far I'm supposed to dig? But he was the boss man. He's the one that had the uniform. He's the one that had the gun. So he made the decisions. Other men in our group, we called ourselves Stripes, by the way. We didn't call ourselves convicts. We called ourselves Stripes. Other Stripes had other jobs. Some of them cut wood all day long. Some of them would do other things. The old men and the ones that got injured, they stayed back at one of the camps. There was 5 stockades. Round Knob stockade was just one of the 5. The sick ones, the injured ones, the old ones who couldn't do no work, they stayed there and they made tallow candles. Tallow ain't nothing but stinking animal fat. But it's better than nothing. I didn't know why they were making tallow candles, because there weren't no candles in our stockades. When it got dark, it was dark. And if the moon wasn't shining, you couldn't see nothing inside. I learned that a bit later on of how come they was doing that. One day, boss man said to me, "You're going with another group. You're going to go up and you're going to work on what's called an open cut." Well, you hear things when you're with a group of guys. You hear what the other guys are doing. An open cut. I knew what an open cut was. Open cut's when you're approaching a mountain and it's not more than 25 feet tall, and the mountain is running right where the train needs to go, where the tracks need to go. So what you got to do is you got to cut a notch. It's like somebody hits you in the teeth and knocks the tooth out. You got a notch. Well, this was an upside down notch in the earth, like a tunnel with no end. That's what an open cut was. To do an open cut, some of these open cuts were made out of mainly dirt. Some of them was made out of mainly rock. Then it was dirt. That was the easy part. My group, the scrapers, we call scrapers. The scrapers would take it down if it was dirt. If it was rock, the scrapers got down to where the rock started. And then somebody else would come along with the sledgehammers. The boys who did that, the stripes who did that, they were called the tunnelers. The tunnelers. The tunnelers were the ones with the muscles as big around as my belly, just about. They had a sledgehammer, the biggest one I'd ever seen in my life, the size of their sledgehammer. And they had the muscles to pick it up and do something with it. Because the sledgehammers were more important to boss man than the stripes. We did things to help use the sledgehammer less. One of those things was for the open cut. Boss man would get part of the stripes to go get softwood like pine, bring it back. Other stripes would get some barrels that was made by these old men back who did the candles. They'd also make barrels and buckets. They bring up buckets and big barrels. They put the big barrel at the top on the rock where they're going to be making the notch. And then get bunches of buckets and they fill them full of water and pass it from one to another, and they'd fill up these great big old barrels. Then they'd get the pine wood and they'd make a big hot fire. When the big hot fire got as hot as it was going to get, boss would say, "Pour the water on!" And they pour the water on, and when he would do that, it'd make this crack kind of a sound. And the rock, the hot rock from the fire, when it met the cold water from the barrel, would crack. That made it easier to bust up the rock with the sledgehammer. Not to help the strike, but to spare the sledgehammer. We would do this over and over as much as necessary. One day I heard a bunch of boss men, they were over there talking, and I happened to be walking by and I heard them say something, and the way they said it got my attention. These were a bunch of hateful men. They had nothing good to say about nobody, never. But I heard them, their voices changed when they said, one of them said, "Major Wilson." And when he said the name Major Wilson, it's like he stood straight and like he's sort of at attention. Well, I figured out real quick, Major Wilson has to be somebody real important. I didn't quite understand that. But then I heard his name a few more times. Every time I'd hear the name Major Wilson, the boss men would talk with respect. They didn't show respect to anybody else, but they did when they would mention the name Major Wilson. Not long after that, when I was reassigned up to one of the tunnels that I got a chance to see Major Wilson. He was a man with a big hat, wide brim, big beard, tall man. He had a leather satchel that went across his shoulder, had bunches of papers, and he had some metal things that somebody said they were instruments. I didn't know what an instrument was, but someone said that's because he's the man who figures out where the pathway has to be all the way up the mountain. He tells boss man where to put the path, where to dig. He's the one who says how far down do you have to dig. He's the one who says where the open cuts has to be. He's the one who says this is going to be where there's going to be a tunnel. And I was supposed to go into a tunnel. I walked up to this tunnel where I was assigned, and there was this great big opening in the earth. It was 15 feet tall. It was 15 feet wide. And when you get about 20, 25 feet inside, it's dark. Because you see, until the tunnel is finished, it ain't nothing but a deep, dark cave. And I had to walk into this big cave where it was dark, and the floor was rough, and it was jagged, and you got a ways, and then it began to go uphill. The floor began to go uphill, kind of steep uphill. My job when I was working inside the tunnel was what they call a grunt. The grunt, you can kind of figure how come it got that name. The grunt they were the stripes who would reach down, and they would pick up great big heavy pieces of rock. 20, 25, maybe 30 pounds of rock. They'd pick these things up, and they was jagged, and the grunts had to carry these pieces of rock. First just walking downhill in the dark cave where you can't hardly see nothing. It ain't smooth. You walk on a jagged surface, you're carrying heavy rock, and it's got jagged edges, and it's poking in your belly, and it's poking in your arms. And you've got to get it outside the tunnel. But you can't stop there. You've got to keep going because that's where boss wants you to put it. You've got to carry it all the way to the low-lying areas where they was filling in places they called ravines. And that's where boss man said put it down. And so that's where you put it down. You can always spot the grunts at a distance. There's this dark red color on their belly of their clothes and on their arms where they're carrying these sharp rocks. The grunt was a hard job to do. Major Wilson, when he would come into the tunnels, which he did every day, he went into all of the tunnels. There are 7 tunnels on this mountain. We was working in 6 of them. Major Wilson would come into the tunnels and he would look. He would look. It was as though he could see things that nobody else could see. One day I looked around and I saw Major Wilson. He'd been walking and looking. He had this little look in his face like he was thinking real hard. He put his hand on the side of the tunnel and he just sort of rubbed the side of the rock. Kind of like a man rubbing his horse when he carried it out. Just rubbed the tunnel. Major Wilson sometimes spoke to boss men loud enough and in a place where some of the stripes could hear. Major Wilson never called us by bad names. I never heard him cuss. He called us the men. The men. Nobody ever referred to me as a man. Nobody. I didn't think a white man could be that way. I'd never been around anybody like the Major. He's the one who decided where to start with digging out the tunnel. The reason that the floor was at an angle when you got in a certain distance inside the tunnel was because when they started when they started and did the first digging on the side of the mountain, they didn't start at the bottom. They started at the top. Major Wilson knew, we're not going to start here, we're going to start up here. He knew exactly where to start the tunnel. And if you didn't do it just right, at the other end, you would be in the wrong place. He figured this stuff out with these instruments and with his brain. I don't understand how a man could do that. We got another assignment. The group that I was with, we had to go to a different tunnel. It was called the High Ridge Tunnel. The thing about the High Ridge Tunnel was that not only did it go up as it climbed the mountain like everything else did, but that tunnel curved. As it went up the mountain, it curved to the right. Major Wilson could walk inside the tunnel and say, "We need to pull over about an inch or so this way." How a man could know that, I don't understand. But if it wasn't right, if it wasn't perfect, it wouldn't work. One thing that was done, because it was so hard to pound the rock to break it all up, was we used some black powder. One of the dumb grunts, would hold an iron rod on a rock. One of the tunnels would get that great big sledgehammer, he'd pound that rod and make a hole in the rock. Then they'd put some black powder in there and they'd make a fuse. Now that was not hard if it was at the ground. But what if it wasn't at the ground? Well, Major Wilson figured all this stuff out. If it wasn't on the ground, he said, just get a board and make you a little ramp and put a bunch of leaves up it. Now, before you do this, of course, you get the tunnelers with the great big muscles. You get them out of the tunnel. You get all the good workers out of the tunnel. And then you get the leaves up on the little board that are leading to where the black powder is. And then you see them grunt with one of them spanking tallow candles. And that grunt will come in carefully, carry this stinking, maybe he can't stink. He reaches down. And he runs like crazy to get out! Because when that noise went off, that was the biggest noise I ever heard in my life. It sounded to me like it was Satan that belched in the pit of hell. All this stuff comes spewing out. All this dust and little rocks and dirt and stuff. And I thought, Lord, spare me from this. But then when it settled down where you could walk in and breathe, the grunts would go back in. And you pick up the pieces and you take them out, put them where Boss Man said to put them. Black powder was expensive, and Major Wilson, he knew everything there was to know in the whole world, obviously, because he learned about this man from this foreign place called Sweden that had created this liquid that was more powerful than black powder. And it would blow up, and it would explode, and it was used, we heard, at railroads way out in the other part of the United States to take down mountains and stuff. Major Wilson ordered a bunch of that Nobel's blasting oil. There was a shed that was built about 400 yards from the depot at Henry Station. And in that shed, over 17,000 pounds of Nobel's blasting oil was mixed with a little bit of sawdust and a little bit of cornmeal to make a blasting mash. That made it easier to work with. And we would put the blasting mash in these holes instead of black powder because it was a lot cheaper. One day a buddy of mine was walking, he was carrying a couple of bottles of this blasting mash. I thought to myself, can't believe boss man told this boy to take them bottles. He's too horsey. He's going to be a problem. He hadn't gone but about a quarter mile, and he was trying to kind of dance while he was going. He shouldn't have done that. Then bottles bumped, and it was boom. I heard it a long time, and dust and dirt flew up into the air. And you couldn't see through it. And I hollered his name, Jackson! His little answer. And all that settled. All the trees that was around there was gone. Jackson was gone. The only thing that was different was, other than stuff being gone, the only thing added was a great big hole in the ground that hadn't been there before. Boss man said, I'm afraid Jackson is in molecules. Well, I didn't know what molecules was, but I figured it had something to do with kind of like being in heaven, because you sure couldn't see that. Everybody from that point forward, though, was really careful carrying in bottles of that Nobel's blasting oil mash. One day, we were working, and I heard boss man say, Major Wilson needs a crew of strong men to help him out. Well, if Major Wilson needed help, I wanted to help. So I actually stepped forward to volunteer. Lots of other men did as well, because we could see that Major Wilson respected us. He was the only one out there who did. We was told to go walk down the path, follow boss man all the way to Henry Station to the depot. So that's what we did. We got down there, and there was the depot, and there was the Salisbury. The Salisbury was the only locomotive that was assigned to this area for this work. And they gathered us right beside the Salisbury. And Major Wilson was standing right there. Boss man said, Major Wilson's been told by the men in charge of the state of North Carolina down in Raleigh that he has a deadline. He's got to get the Swannanoa tunnel at the top of the mountain finished by this deadline. Well, the Swannanoa tunnel was the longest one. The shortest of these 6 tunnels we was working on was 89 feet. That's still pretty long when you consider it's solid rock, 15 feet tall, 15 feet wide, and it's got to be made smooth, which means it's got to be more than 15 feet, because you got to dig it out, put it in the dirt, make it smooth. The Swannanoa tunnel at the top, the length 1,832 feet long. That is 6 football fields long. That was so long that it took so much time. When the grunts would go in after there'd been the explosion and pounding of the rock, and we'd have to pick up these heavy rocks, we'd have to carry it. We'd have to walk like a couple of football fields, carrying this heavy rock, poking in our belly and our arms. That's just to get to the mouth of the tunnel. Then we had to carry it further. It took a long time. Major Wilson figured out there was a way that could be speeded up. It involved the Salisbury, the locomotive. Boss man said, as Major Wilson stood there, just looked at us with this look of satisfaction on his face. Boss man said, the Major needs your help. He needs you to pick up the Salisbury off of the tracks where it sits, pull it, pick it up, and walk it over about 8 feet and put it down on temporary tracks that are spiked straight to the dirt. And then those spiked tracks will be pushed on and the train will work its way up. When the train gets over these two, onto the next two, some of these strong stripes would pick up the back two rails, run around the train, put it down in front, exactly
5 feet.
from center to center, spike it to the ground, and keep pushing. I thought, we're going to die. We can't pick up our locomotive. But then Major Wilson spoke. He spoke to us and he said, men, I'm proud of you for what you've accomplished. Nobody, except maybe my granny, had ever said they was proud of me. No white man had ever said they was proud of me. And if they had, I wouldn't believe it. But I believed Major Wilson. I wanted to do this for Major Wilson. There was about 60 of us, and we got all the way around the Salisbury. We grabbed hold of something that we thought was strong enough that wouldn't break off. And Major Wilson himself walked around to look at what we was holding on to. And everybody got something that was strong enough. And Boss Man said, when I say the word, I want you to use every bit of energy that you got, and I want you to pick this locomotive up and do what you need to do to help Major Wilson. And Major Wilson then said, men, do you think you can do it? I think you can. And we all said, yes, sir, we can. We were so energized because he spoke to us with encouragement, with respect. We was like a bunch of champion horses. We were standing around there. We were so excited. We was getting to do something for Major when he could watch us and see us do it. And there we was grabbing, we was squeezing and letting go. We was getting our muscles pumped and getting ready. And Boss Man said, 1, 2, 3, pick her up! So we picked it up. And we inched it over, and we inched it over. And Boss Man said, get her straight, put her down. And we put her down. And it worked. And then we started pushing. A bunch of scrapers, about 100 scrapers had gone ahead to scrape the path. Because we was going on the stagecoach road. The stagecoach road was much too steep. It wasn't suitable to be the path of where the tracks would go for real. But it had to be what we did to push the Salisbury up the mountain. So it worked. And we pushed it. And we pushed it. There were places it was pretty steep. Every stripe, except those who were idiots so bad they couldn't, helped and pushed. Taking a turn pushing. Sometimes a turn pushing would last 30 minutes. Sometimes it would last 10 minutes, depending on how steep it was. Every stripe, there was about 600 stripes that took part in this process as the crews would change. There were some oxen hooked up. They was helping to pull while we was pushing. And we got that thing all the way. It took 2 weeks non-stop. We could not stop at all. If you stopped, it would start to roll backwards. We couldn't let that happen. So we pushed, and we got up to the top. When it got to the top and got on the yon side of the Swananoa Tunnel, other stripes had already built some wooden carts. They were attached. The tracks were put down temporarily to back it in. And when there'd be explosions, after the explosions, they'd back it in, fill 5 wooden carts with rock. This was so much more than could ever be done, and it would pull it out, and it sped the work up tremendously. There was a crew at each end of the Swananoa Tunnel because it was so long. That makes it even more incredible that Major Wilson determined the spot to start at the west end. He determined the spot to start at the east end. And every day he would go in, making sure it was going exactly right. How could he walk in the tunnel and know It was going right. You're in the middle of a rock. How do you know where you are? He knew. He could figure it out. If he had been 1/4 inch off, they wouldn't have met. In early March 1879, one morning, it was about the end of the first week of March, before our work started, we heard a sound we had never heard before. We was about to start. The tunnelers with the great big muscles, one of them had put his hands on the sledgehammer. He was about to pull it back, and we heard this sound. Our eyes got as big as a plate. Boston said, "Don't you let them win. You gotta bust through this. Don't you let them bust through. We gotta do it." It was the other crew. We're getting close. We were energized and we heard that little rat tap tap sound. We was as fired up as a cat asleep behind Granny's rocker when she rocks back on its tail. We jumped up and we was ready to work. And we was pounding them rocks and picking them things up, tossing them in the back of that cart, getting them out of there. We was going to win this battle. March 11, 1879. The major was on our side of the tunnel, on the western side. When the striker with the biggest muscles, he reached down, he put his giant hands on that handle, he swung back, and he pounded that rock. And it broke and fell down through to the other side. We had won. Major was so excited, he jumped up and down. He ran and he hugged me. I was the one closest to him. He hugged. The smartest man in the world hugged me at every strike in the tunnel. And he said, "Thank you, congrats, you've done it. I'm so proud of you." I thought I was going to cry. I didn't understand why I thought I was going to cry. I hadn't cried since I was a kid. And I didn't understand how I could feel on the inside the way that I did. But I had to work hard not to cry. I didn't understand it. But we were celebrating. Major walked up to the hole and he spoke through to the crew on the other side. We still wasn't finished. We had a couple of more months of work to do. But it happened and the whole project was finished. I was still assigned to this area for some of the last stuff when the rails had been laid all the way through. In July 1879 was when the first locomotive went all the way from Old Fort to Ridgecrest on its own power on the rails. And I was there when that happened. Then the most amazing thing occurred. Boss man came up to me a couple of days later and he said, you got a telegram. I didn't think that could happen. He said, go down to Henry Station. Like he was thinking, how could anybody send you a telegram? And I went down to Henry Station. It was a telegram from my granny. When I'd been sentenced to prison, my granny got a job up north. She got a job, turned out with a rich man. She's doing his laundry. Rich man working with the railroad. He had something to do with the railroad. And she overheard conversations of the rich man talking about this project, this railroad project in the mountains of North Carolina, where they did these tunnels and they used this Nobel's blasting oil. She knew that was where I was. And she knew it had gotten finished. I knew I would never see my granny because she lived way up north somewhere. She was the only person alive that I cared about. She was the only one that cared about me. And she had sent me a telegram. And the telegram said, "Every day at 8 p.m., I touch the train rails. If you touch, we'll be connected." That night at 8 o'clock, or as close as I could figure to 8, I went down to the track. And I got on my knees. And I grabbed the rail. And I put my head down and I put my forehead on it. And I cried. I cried and I said, "Granny, I love you, Granny. I know you care about me and I care about you." We was connected. We was connected. The railroad had connected my granny and me. The railroad brought a miracle to me. It brought miracles to people all in western North Carolina. It opened up this part of the state so that people could get their crops to a market. They could get their crafts to a market. They could go visit family that was special to them. Visitors even could come in. It changed the world. And the railroad convicts who worked on this, whose names were never even recorded, made all the difference. And that's the story of the railroad convict.
Little will probably be willing to answer a few questions. And you see why we didn't introduce him because of the rather dramatic entrance here. But now he's Steve Little, sort of. But anybody have a question for him about putting this together or about being a convict?
I have no real life personal experience. I didn't have to make all of this up.
A lot of research.
A lot of research.
Yes, Andy.
The research is from where? Letters?
The research came from working, finding material in a variety of libraries. But the main source, the best source, happened to be two legislative investigative committees designated by the North Carolina General Assembly, one in 1877, one in 1879. They sent some investigating officials up from Raleigh to Old Fort and the area around Old Fort to investigate what they thought was mismanagement. They actually had the audacity to think that my hero, Major James W. Wilson, was not managing it properly. Major Wilson was completely vindicated. He was doing nothing wrong. He was doing everything right. It was because of Major Wilson that this thing happened. And all of these interviews established that quite clearly. But these interviews included information that talked about what the convicts had to eat at their mealtime, for example. One of the things they also had was they had a beverage that they referred to as coffee. But it was a vile thing. It didn't taste like coffee. The railroad convict had tried coffee once or twice in his life. He knew what it was supposed to taste like. But this stuff was made 4 parts of ground up rye seeds to 1 part coffee. Sometimes they threw in a little bit of chicory if they could get enough that they would roast themselves. The Stripes, who were friends with the cooks, got a little squirt of molasses in theirs. But my convict couldn't quite figure out if that was an improvement or not. But these records helped a great deal. My research took me as far north as Boston to the George Fisher Baker Museum of Harvard Business School, as far south as Kennesaw, Georgia, just outside of Atlanta, where the archives of the Southern Railway are. The library at Wake Forest University was my first source, had a wonderful selection there. The University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill Library, the Pack Library in Asheville is a superior source of information. A fantastic array of books and information are there. Those are the main areas that I searched, but it's been a passion that I started in probably 1970 when I was a student at Wake Forest. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned the one man who died carrying the explosive, but I know a number of convicts died, a large number.
The total number of deaths is a number that is elusive. I've tried to find a definitive number of that. I can tell you it is in the hundreds. It is probably between 400 and 600 convicts total for different methods. There were a couple of landslides. There was one collapse of a portion of the Swannanoa Tunnel at the western end. A lady just a few years ago who is now deceased showed me, her grandmother had showed her where the burial site was for those convicts, just on the western side of the western portal of the Swannanoa Tunnel. The way that was treated was the convict was taken out. If he was in a tunnel, a hole was dug and he was put in. Maybe boss man would take his hat off. He'd put his hat back on, get back to work. And that's what happened. There was no respectful way of dealing with that. Yes, sir.
What happened to the convicts afterwards?
The convicts were, many of them were assigned to different places. Now, one of the brutal things, this is just adding one more brutality. If a convict's sentence was finished, if he finished out his sentence while he was working up on the mountain, if he wanted to go back to where he was from, if he was from eastern North Carolina, which most of them were, by the way, he didn't get a free ride. He got a free ride up because he was a slave. He was a free man at that point. So if he wanted to ride the train, he had to pay for a ticket. He had no money. So they would start walking, and who knows what happened to them. Those who were still, like in my story, my character had not finished his sentence, so he got to go back to Raleigh. I am writing a book, by the way. I'm calling it Railroad Convict. There have been a couple of times that I thought I was finished, then I'd add more to it, and I'm not quite finished with it yet, but hopefully it'll be out next year. It will tell what I told tonight, plus some more. Yes, sir. Major Wilson was widely recognized as one of the most talented engineers, and I don't mean a guy who drives the train, I mean a civil engineer in the entire United States. He went to work in a number of other railroads and many other locations. He was a native of North Carolina, and he lived his last years in Charlotte. He married a lady from Burke County, in the same family line as Senator Sam Irving. And there was a monument. It's a small monument. It's a bronze plaque. It is put on a granite spike-shaped piece. It looks like a railroad spike. And that is presently located at the Old Fort train depot in the town of Old Fort. But I went, interestingly enough, out to Austin, Texas in June of this year to a family reunion for my hero, Major Wilson, for a reunion of his descendants. And I did my program for them, which was a huge treat to do. Other questions? Yes, sir.
I had heard it said, and you referred to it, that the use of nitroglycerin, I had heard, was on the Old Fort Ridgecrest project.
Yes, sir.
Project. My understanding was that was the first major construction job on which nitroglycerin was used as an explosive.
That is correct in the southeastern United States. It had been used out west. Perhaps, and the ethnic group of workers in the western part of the United States were the Chinese, who did a lot of this railroad work. And they were the first ones who began working. And before it was acknowledged that it was so unstable and so horribly explosive in nature, and basically it's so hard to control, it gave rise to that expression, someone hasn't got the chance to China. That's where it came from. As they were working with nitroglycerin, they had basically no chance of survival. Other questions? Yes, sir.
You read John Ely's novel,
Yes.
Road. For folks who aren't familiar with it, would you just would share that it is a novel, but
Yes.
the details of the construction of the old port routes are
Absolutely.
accurate.
That story is called The Road. It is available. I know you can get it through the internet, through Barnes & Noble, Amazon, places like that. You might can find it in some other bookstores as well. It was written in the late 60s. John Ely is a North Carolina author who's written some wonderful novels about the mountains of this state. And this story, The Road, I read it in 1968, and that's what hooked me with my interest in this railroad, was reading that novel. It has a character named Willoughby White. He's probably Major Wilson, and as he leads through and has some fascinating tales. He takes more liberties than I do in my telling of the tale. I wrote my history thesis, by the way, on this project when I was a student at Wake Forest. I later learned through a fascinating tale that one of John Ely's residences is in Winston-Salem. When I was in law school, I had the pleasure of meeting him. I went to his residence, and I took with me my thesis and asked if he would look at it, and he was delightful and said, "Of course I would love to." He opened it. The first thing he looked at was the Videography, and he said, "You did a good job. You found the 1877 and 1879 legislative study, investigative commission reports." And he said he made his first draft before he knew about the existence of those reports, and then read them and rewrote his book to include that information. But I read his book. If you can find it, your presence here tonight makes me think you would really enjoy reading it. Yes, sir.
John was in the 90s, I think.
Yes.
And I think he's still around.
I think he is. He has a house in Penland. His wife, those of you who've seen the Spider-Man movies about 4 or 5 years ago, his wife is Aunt May in all of those movies. Rosemary Harris is her name. It's like she served me tea on their veranda in 1979. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
You gave a very vivid description, at least in my eye, of the work and the conditions and so forth. Could you just tell us a little bit about what it would take to get a prison sentence that would allow you to
Oh, sure.
have that happen to you?
Sure.
My understanding it was basically a continuation of slavery.
In many respects, I think slavery was better than the work that a convict had to do, especially a black convict. They had no rights. They had nothing that they could do. They were at the bottom of the socio-economic rung, and they had nothing available except the ability to hope. But what did they do to get sentenced? I have found in my research a list of the offenses that they committed. They don't have any names, of course. It ranges from petty larceny. Petty larceny could be they stole $1 out of your pocket. You could get a 6-month sentence for that. If you stole $10, you could get a 5-year sentence for that back in the 1870s. The most popular sentence, the most commonly found length of sentence of all of the convicts was a 4-year sentence. More convicts on the mountain have a 4-year sentence than any other duration. The shortest sentence of people of convicts who were assigned to work on the mountain was 6 months. And there were a few life sentence people who worked there. So, some of them, there were some who did escape. Like my character can't quite imagine that, but there were some.
They didn't get eaten.
They managed, but we don't know. Maybe they did, I don't know. Couldn't remember that. Any other questions?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.